Good morning, everybody. Happy to see you arriving. Always happy to have you here and love to see your chats of where you are, how things are internally, externally, before we begin our day together. I did see that Richard Shiner has showed up, and Richard and his wife Marcia have been generous sponsors of Torah study through this spring and into this month. Very happy to have him. The Poconos in Pittsburgh, throughout Pennsylvania. Hi, from Canada. Judy, glad to have you here. Pittsfield, Mass. Lovely part of the state. Newport, Marin County, Nancy, nice to see you. Lauren, I just saw your message. Well, we grieve with you on your cousin's recent death, and may our study together contribute to the ascent of his soul in your heart and mind, and in those who he knew and touched. Stephen, back in Baltimore, but missing the grandchildren in Cupertino. Yes, that is the world that we've created, where we're so mobile and therefore distant from each other. To have grandchildren so far away. I'm familiar with it, as both my sister and I, as it were, did that to our parents. We both moved to California, and now I've moved back to New York, and my sons, who I raised in Northern California, are back there themselves. It's made for a very long year of not seeing each other except on Zoom. It's been true for all of us. God willing, we are truly turning the corner, and soon it will feel, not only be, but feel possible and right to be able to travel that way. I'm glad that you were able to do so. So let's turn to our study together today. And as we do, begin with a bracha. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. The power of studying Torah is that it can help us experience holiness in our lives. Holiness is a difficult term in many ways for us to grasp and to grapple with. What does it mean to be holy, to feel holiness, to experience holiness in our lives? It does have some of that intention of separation, but in classical sort of rabbinic ritual terms, one aspect of kedusha, of holiness, which we can also translate as hafrasha, of setting apart. Hafrasha, setting apart in that way, was often for the sake of elevation, for the sake of it being or becoming or being offered as a sacrifice. And sacrifice always has the implication and the sense of drawing near, of coming close to God. And I'd like to suggest that that's part of what the text we're going to address today might invite us to consider, how that might be true for us. How does that work at all in the world? And in part, I'd like to offer this teaching as a teaching connected to the anniversary of the death of George Floyd, and also as some consolation for us following the recent violence in Israel, in Gaza, in Jerusalem, in the territories. The text that we're going to look at is from the Eish Kodesh, the writings, the preaching of the Piezetzner Rebbe from the Warsaw Ghetto. And this is from early on in his time there. This is from 1940, so it's 71 years ago. And it was still at a point where the extermination of the Jews was not yet part of the plan of the Nazis, and it hadn't entered the consciousness yet of those who were in the ghetto or around the world that could actually take place. And so there is still some sense of that balance of grappling with the immediate suffering of his people in the ghetto and of the terror of that time, and the capacity to hope and see something from that experience that might yet be born. So Adi has put in the chat a link to today's text for those of you who would like to download it and follow along in that way. Otherwise, we'll turn to it here now. And here we have the opening of the text from the Eish Kodesh. And it's based on verses that are familiar to those of us who are synagogue goers. They're the verses in Parshat Bahalotcha at the end of chapter 10 that are captured at the beginning of the Torah service, when we take the Torah from the ark, and then at the conclusion of the Torah service, when we put the Torah back in the ark. And the two verses, Vayhi ben Soah ha'aron, Vayomer Moshe, Kum Adonai v'yafutzu oivecha mipane, v'yafutzu oivecha v'yanusu misanecha mipanecha, right? Moses saying when the ark set out, arise, O God, may your enemies be scattered, let those who oppose you flee before you. And then the next verse, Uvnu Chol Yomar, when it came to rest, Shuv Adonai Revot of Israel, right? Return, O Lord, to your place, right? That those two verses then are how we frame our Torah service. We don't usually notice, though, because they've become so present in our mind, that when they appear in the Torah, they are surrounded by two inverted letters nun. So these two verses are in some way meant to be set apart from the flow of the Torah reading. And it's quite unusual for there to be this sort of insertion in the text. And it leads to comments by Rashi that are immediately noted by the Piezetzner, that Rashi says that these letters appear here in order to let us know that this is not the place where they should appear. It's not altogether clear where they should appear, or if they should appear together in that way. He doesn't say. And also, it leads to a very interesting teaching that, in fact, what we call the Chumash, the 5 books of Moses, might actually be considered 7, because there's Bereshit, Shmot, Vayikra, those first 3 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, then the opening of the book of Bamidbar, the book of Numbers, up to this point, then these 2 verses encapsulated and surrounded by the inverted letters Nun, sort of like brackets. That's a 5th book. Then there's the conclusion of the book of Bamidbar. That's a 6th book. And then the whole of the book of Deuteronomy is a 7th. So it's an interesting teaching. And of course, 7 is a powerful number in our tradition. So that's just something to take note of. But the Piezetzner focuses on Rashi saying that the inverted letters Nun precede and follow these verses that to indicate that they're not in their right place. The Piezetzner then says, in this light, we must understand why were letters Nun selected to be the symbols, simaniot, and why inverted Nuns in particular. Further, Rashi comments on the word kuma, right? Arise. This is because the ark would precede the people by 3 days, and Moses would say, Amod, halt, stand still, wait for us, don't go any further. Right? And so it's really interesting that in the Kuma, right, in the arise, O Lord, there's already implicit that sense of wait for us, don't be so far away. And then further, what's the relationship of may our enemies be scattered? Why does that have to appear here at all? What's the relationship to Kuma, rise, O Lord, or halt, God? Why doesn't it say what Moses actually was saying? Wait for us, right? And this idea of the ark being 3 days ahead. So the Piezetzner, having just completed Shavuot and reading this Torah portion, calls to mind the prayer recited by the congregation on the Shalosh Regalim in Yom Kippur when the Kohanim, the priests, would bless the people. And the blessing is that is recited here, may our prayers be received as the whole offerings and sacrifices of old. Rahmana, right? Ana Rachum, O merciful one, in your great mercy, return your Shekhinah to Zion, your city, and the order of service to Jerusalem. May our eyes see your return to Zion in mercy, and there may we serve you in fear as in olden days, years of old. So on the one hand, the Piezetzner actually is just going to focus on this last phrase, and there may we serve you in fear, right? Lovdecha b'yirah, right? Na'avodcha b'yirah. Let us serve you in fear as in ancient days. But I think that we have to keep in mind that this whole prayer is this sense of God's distance. God having abandoned Jerusalem. The Shekhinah is no longer present over the city of Jerusalem. And we are no longer able to do what we did in the past. So we have to substitute our words of prayer for the sacrifices. We have to pray that God will come back. And I think implicit in, again, the citation of this prayer, even though he's going to focus on serving God in fear, that there is this sense of, where is God now? How is God present? How do we sense God's presence? Just as the ark was 3 days distant, and Moses had to say, Kuma, Amod, wait for us. So understand, right? Sarich la'avin. We might think that now, in this time of exile and suffering, Bisman hagalut v'hatzarot. I think tzarot, he's not just talking about the generic suffering of galut, of not being in the land, of God being distant in that generic sense. He's talking about the tzarot, the tsaros that people are feeling, experiencing in the ghetto. We may have even more fear than in an antiquity. Yesh lanu yoter yirah, right? And he's talking about real fear. Fear for our lives, fear for our children, fear that we don't get dysentery, fear that we have food to eat, fear that we're not beaten by the police who might come through, fear that we're not going to be handed over by informers and so on. We have even more fear. How is it then that we say specifically that God saves and redeems us, that then we will serve you in fear? Why would he even say that? Now we have fear. What kind of fear are we talking about? Well, it's true that now we have fear due to our lowliness and suffering, right? Merov oni v'tzar, our poverty, our poorness, our powerlessness, and our suffering. Nevertheless, it's difficult for us to serve God out of fear because they simply don't allow us. An interesting comment. That the real fear that is being called for, the fear that's being referred to in that prayer, is not fear which is terror, but fear which is the loving response to a yearning sense for God's presence, to be in relationship. Not a yearning because of distance, not a yearning out of a fear of abandonment, but a fear that comes from loving awareness that everything I do has implications for how my beloved knows of my love. And we can't do that now because they don't let us, because of this oppression, because we're not given the spaciousness to actually cultivate that fear. And also because of our broken hearts and fallen spirits, right? We can't do it. We can't arouse that sort of energy to cultivate that sort of yirah. But this will hardly be the case when God saves and redeems us. Then we will surely serve you in fear. Now, for the person who's able to serve God with all their might, despite their suffering and difficulties, their deep yearning for God to help them in their difficulty supports them to serve God even more. Their yearning has the capacity to transform anger to compassion and to draw out salvation. Here's the turn in his teaching. He set us up to say, oh yeah, of course, we can't serve God in a true way. There's no way that we can generate that sort of true fear of God. There's no way that we can energize the cosmic dynamic of our love and serving of God, which brings about redemption and salvation and beauty to the world. We're stuck here in the ghetto. We're impoverished, mirov oni, right? Because of our poverty and tsar and our suffering. It says, but the person even in their tsaros, right? But tsarotav, serves God with everything that they have. b'chol yecholto. They're yearning to serve God, right? That God will help them in their suffering, in their straits, mimitzukotav, in their narrow places. They're in a canyon, right? In a crevice, right? That sort of faithfulness and trust and yearning for God's help helps us to serve God more. And that then is useful. It brings about the consequence of transforming roges l'rachamim, anger to compassion, and to bring salvation. So what is roges? Let me stop here. The teachers and theologians of the Shoah, from the time of the Shoah, tried to find language to describe what was happening and to understand the cosmic order that was prevailing at this time. And the violence of that time, the destruction of that time was so massive throughout Poland, throughout Eastern Europe, was so great, beyond anything that anybody had seen or conceived of before, that the language that they used was roges, anger, and za'am, fury. That somehow the divine forces of chaos were let loose in the world. And we have to give some thought to that. We talk about Yom Kippur as a day of atonement. And for us, that is what it is. It is a cleansing of our own soul. But I recommend that you take a look at Jacob Milgram's commentary on the book of Yikra, the book of Leviticus, in the Jewish Publication Society translation and commentaries. He's very clear that in the biblical mind, divine power was as destructive as it was creative. And that there is a way in which human activity was meant to and had the possibility of containing the destructive forces in order to maintain life and promote liveliness and livelihood. What happens over the course of the year through our sins is that the power of the altar to maintain that right alignment of the world with divine goodness becomes weaker. And if left unattended, would break down, and the forces of negativity, of destruction, would be released. The ritual of Yom Kippur, of purgation, which is what Kippur means, is purging the altar of the accumulated sinfulness of the people in the world in order for that proper order to be maintained, so that it will be one of creativity, of life and liveliness, rather than destruction. And somehow the teachers in the Shoah, I think what the Piezetzner is saying here, is that somehow the cosmic order has been perverted. And the forces of roges, of anger, have been let loose. And he's calling on his students, his congregants, and us to witness when the forces of roges, anger, are let loose, in order for us to engage more deeply in our avodah, our own spiritual practice, to serve God b'yirah, to bring to bear the fear of God, which is not fear of roges, but fear of that imbalance and the desire for balance and for love to prevail. And that's what he's suggesting here when he says that when we engage in our avodah, despite the tsaros that we feel, that we have the capacity to bring about rachamim, which will overtake the roges, that the compassion will overtake the anger, the violence, and bring about salvation. And how does that, how do we understand that? He brings in this idea that we function in two dimensions because we can perceive the nistar, the hidden, as well as that which is present, the nochach. Nistar and nochach, hidden and present, in Hebrew language also are the terms for the third person and the second person. The person who's hidden, the person who's not present, we speak about in the third person. Oh yeah, he, she, they're not here, but so we can talk about them. We can say all sorts of things because they're not here. The third person is hidden. Nochach is the one who's present in your face. And we, when we say a bracha, speak in both the nistar and the nochach. The nistar is when we say the nochach, the present, the second person is Baruch Atah. Praised are you, second person. Asher Kidshanu b'mitzvotav, who sanctified us by his commandments, third person. In Baruch Shamar, right, in the morning service, we have a prayer that says, praised is the one who spoke and the world came into being, third person. But then we come to the closing bracha. Baruch atah, praised are you. But this is not the case for the angels. The angels only speak of God in the third person. Kadosh, kadosh, kadosh. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts, wherever that is. Baruch, kavod Adonai mimkomo. Praised is God's glory from its place, wherever that is. All in the third person. This is because Israel arose in the divine mind. That is, before creation, God imagined us. And so in some way we were hidden away there in the divine mind. But also our unique status is evident in action, in this dimension of Asiyah, in this world. So we function and are present both in the hidden divine mind and in this world of action. That's why we're able to bless God, who's beyond what is conceivable, who is hidden, but also for that which is revealed in this world of action. We can know both that which is not present and visible, as well as that which is present and visible. And we can access that which is hidden behind that which is present. But the angels exist only in one dimension, have only one manner of being. They are in a world beyond that which is revealed, and that's why they bless God only in the third person in a hidden manner. So this is evidenced then in our capacity to transform compassion from compassion to anger. We can take compassion and turn it into anger to befall the wicked, and then from anger to compassion for Israel. Another way to say this, they can transform the awareness of God who is revealed to God's hidden countenance hastarat panim. When God's countenance is hidden, that's when roges roams the land, when anger and za'am, fury, is let loose. And from hastarat panim, from God's hiddenness to God's revealed presence, because we exist in both planes. When Moses ascended to heaven and argued with the angels, they in the end recognized his arguments that they don't have bodies, and they weren't born, so they don't have parents to honor. They don't work, so they don't have to rest on Shabbat. They can't utter falsehoods. They can't covet because they don't, have. They're not gendered and don't have lives of sexuality and so on. They don't possess anything, so they can't covet. So therefore, the Torah belongs to us, and we deserve to get it. In the end, they recognized Moses' arguments and became his beloved friends, and each one gave him a gift. But how does this make sense? That they were compelled by his arguments to agree to give Moses the Torah. Why did they give him gifts? They lost the argument. And he has a little digression. The Zohar, mentions this also, but but in the Talmud, the angels were not acting against Israel's good. What aroused them to so greatly in love with what aroused them so greatly in love to then give gifts to Moses. We see that this is part of the disputation. That is, okay, lefize haniskar le'el, zeba atzmo haya min havikuach. Their giving Moses gifts was part of what happened. It wasn't action and consequence. It was the thing itself. Their engagement with Moses and giving him gifts was one and the same process. They said, Ma anosh kitez karenu, uven adam kitif kedenu, right? What is the human that you're mindful of them, and human beings that you pay attention? Oh, Yud-He Vav-He, our God, how majestic is your name over all the earth. Then why do you give your splendor, which is above the heavens? Why are you going to give this Torah, which is hidden in these divine realms? Why are you going to give it above the heavens down to the creatures who live below the heavens? Moses acted and changed them from angels of anger, hafachotam meroges l'rachamim, to angels of compassion. In this manner, he demonstrated to them the greatness of Israel, who are able to transform anger to compassion through themselves, right? Even in them, even in the angels, to the point that they gave Moses gifts. So what happened was that Moses argued with the people, with the angels, and transformed them from roges to rachamim, from anger to compassion, and they then gave gifts, right? That the process was of transformation. So let's return to our opening focus on there we will serve you in fear. Now, even though we experience great fear, nevertheless, it's difficult for us to serve God fully or wholeheartedly, b'shleimut. That's the significance then of Rashi's comment that when the ark set out, that this was not its place. This means not only that this is not its correct place in the Torah, but suggests that it is no other place. That's why God made symbols out of the inverted letters nun. The Talmud refers to the bent nun and the straight nun. Nun is one of those 5 letters that have 2 forms. One when they're in the middle of the word, one when they're at the end of the word. And one is straight. The final nun is just a straight line. And the nun that shows up in the middle of the word is kind of bent. And what does that mean? It means that the bent nun and the straight nun, faithful when bent, faithful when straight, What does that mean? When Israel experience all good things, they bend themselves to serve God. But when they are bent due to suffering, this is the inverted nun. And it is then that the Ark and Torah are hidden from Israel. This then is Moses' prayer, arise, O God. May your enemies be scattered. Let those who oppose you flee before you. These are the enemies of Israel. When they flee, neither the Ark nor Torah will be hidden, and there will be no inverted nun, only pure service of God, drawing near to God out of joy and all good things. Okay, we're going to have to bring this home for a landing, explain why did I bring it. What are we supposed to take from this? That we too experience times in which the nun seems to be inverted, in which God's presence is hidden. We see it in times of war, in times of suffering. When people's hearts and minds become clouded and they look for enemies, not just that they suffer at the hands of enemies, they then look for them. The greatest challenge to come out of the recent violence between Palestinians and Israelis was not the issue of Gaza and Israel. It was rather between Israelis and Israelis, between Jewish Israelis and Palestinian Israelis, that they went out looking for enemies. That's the inverted nun. That's the hastara. That's when God is hidden. And that's when our avodah of devoting ourselves to see that which is hidden and to bring it into revelation has the potential to transform roges to rachamim, to transform the outbreak of anger and fury to compassion, shlemut, wholeness, wholeheartedness, to completeness and peace. There are all sorts of antecedents to what precipitated the war in Israel. And we can point to them all and know that no one's hands are clean. Israel has the right to protect itself from rockets fired randomly at civilians. That is a war crime. And Israel has a right to defend itself. And Palestinians have a right to a life free from domination of others in territory that they can control. And when they see that law is being bent for the benefit of one and not the other, they see compassion being turned into roges. They see righteousness become self-righteousness and injustice. And we could say that the same happens here on our own streets. A moment of inverted nun took place a year ago today when the hidden soul of a human being was not made present, but was taken away. When the soul of the police officer became so hidden that it couldn't recognize the humanity of the person on whose neck he was bent. That was the bent nun, the bent knee on the neck of George Floyd. What was the consequence? The consequence was the outbreak of roges, of anger, of fury, that actually, for many people, revealed that which was hidden. The hidden processes of systemic racism, the hidden practices of a racially structured society, and all of the various ways that I've talked about, that other people have written about, of how we unthinkingly, because it is so hidden, enact racialized lives that cost people livelihood, freedom, freedom from fear, freedom from fear of death. That was brought from hidden to be visible. And when we can do that, we can transform roges to rachamim. We have the potential to transform the world. Now, the Piezetzner does live in a world of a certain binary of Israel and the Gentiles, who, to a certain extent, in his binary, are always bad. And in the ghetto, it was particularly evident. And so I forgive him of setting up a system of, we can transform rachamim to roges for the goyim, for our enemies. Right? And he's picking up the word, vayanusu misanecha mipanecha, your enemies, not just those who oppose you, your enemies. Yes, we want Zam to go there. We want roges to go there. Save us, God, from this. I get it. But we have to be really careful in our world, particularly we. If we have the freedom to be here at 11:30 on a Tuesday to study Torah, we're not living in a world where we can afford to say, oh yes, we have the power to turn rachamim into roges, and we know where to point it. We have to be the ones who engage in roges, who feel it, who absorb it, who recognize the potential for it, who see how it can burst out when we don't promote a world of rachamim. It's our duty, he says, to be those who can transform roges to rachamim, who can engage God both in the material world of Asiyah and in the hidden realms beyond comprehension. To say both Baruch Atah and Asher Kitchanu Mitzvotav, the second person and the third person, to work in those dimensions to bring that which is hidden into visibility, to make this a world of bounty for all, a world of justice for all, a world of freedom for all, a world of compassion for all. That's what the avodah is that he's inviting us to. He, the Piezetzner in the ghetto, recognizes that it's still possible when we feel roges to transform it to rachamim. And that's what our avodah is. And that's what will bring back Shekhinah to Zion. That's what will return God to our own hearts so that we can serve God. Kiyamei olam. Like the Kshanim kadmoniot, as days of old. and years gone by. So I pray that we find for ourselves the practices and the ways to see more clearly that which is hidden in our social structures, in our interactions with each other, and even in our own hearts and minds, so that we can constantly engage in those practices that transform roges to rachamim.